Welcome everybody, Merry Christmas. We have a special, very special bonus episode for you in this Christmas day, actually the whole Christmas week. This year we wanted to reflect on a few topics that are important for us as Scrum Masters, as Agile coaches, and of course as Agile practitioners in general. So let's dive into it. What's today about? Listen in. So today I'm going to share one of the key personal reflections I've had as a Scrum Master and Agilist over the past few years. It's potentially the hardest lesson that I've had to learn as a Scrum Master. And it's a lesson that shifted, my way of working with teams and individuals and how I choose to observe and intervene when working with teams and individuals. That there's a simple way to describe it, and then there's the right way to describe it. But the simple, even if it's not very clear, I'll clarify it as we go, is that we need to learn to see what's really there instead of what our mind wants us to see. And as I say this, I realize immediately that that way to describe it is not very clear. But bear with me, I think it will become clear as we go forward in a second. When we observe what is going on, we are, in our minds, right, making connections, analyzing, jumping into conclusions. And it's okay, it's normal, don't beat yourself up for this. It will always be this way. It's part of how our brain works. However, these conclusions we jump to, they stop being data, i.e. things to consider, and they start being critical or nasty for us when we start acting on those conclusions without reflecting further, without analyzing what is actually going on and taking those conclusions we jump to as data rather than the truth. And one of the most difficult things with this jumping to conclusions is that it gets worse with experience. There are certain things that get better with experience, and of course, being more balanced, knowing of more potential situations that we need to be ready for. But this jumping into conclusions and acting on them, this is, it's an anti-pattern. This anti-pattern happens even more often when we have more experience. And it's exactly because we've seen more things. We've seen certain things happen over and over, and we just apply our past experience to the current situation. However, when we do that, what we're doing is, instead of seeing what's there, we're kind of taking the conclusions we've had in our mind and we're projecting them onto the situation at hand. So what I'm suggesting here is that when we have this strong conclusion, right, like we're sure something is as we imagine it is when we should be even more careful. We should be ready to listen when the conclusion is at its strongest. What I'm trying to say here is that as Scrum Masters, we should act more like scientists, right? The conclusion isn't a conclusion, it's an hypothesis. And we should ask questions. We should be curious to validate that assumption by asking questions from the team. Let me give you a concrete example. Something that has happened, I'm sure, to many of you, and it has happened to me many times. I see teams being a little bit, argumentative, perhaps conflictual in their way of communicating when certain topics are brought up. So here's an example. I'm talking to the team and I say, hey, I see that when we bring up the subject of application performance, some of you feel the need to say that performance is not a problem. I wonder why that is. And what I'm trying to say with this example is I'm using a concrete observation, right? Some people will say, performance is not a problem, stop talking about that. And I am relating that to something that is happening with them, right? I'm asking the question, why is that? Why do you feel the need to say that performance is not a problem? And this is quite different from asking a question like, why are you so defensive about performance of your application, right? Like the defensive part is my conclusion, and I'm projecting that into the situation. So instead of doing that, it's better to say, to relate, right, to describe the concrete observations you've made, that people feel the need to say performance is not a problem, and then ask why. And let the team themselves process that and come up with their own vision of what is happening. Now, I'm not saying that you should take what the team says as the truth either, but because they are saying it, you can now use that to build an experiment on how to change it, right? So for example, maybe this team needs to actually get some data to evaluate whether the performance is indeed as bad as other people are saying or not. So if people say, well, it's not a problem because I work with the app every day, I'm developing the app and I see there's no problem. And then you can ask, okay, well, that's probably true if you observe that there's no performance when you are using it, because users are reporting some performance problems. How about if we create an experiment around it? For example, collect some data from a user machine and compare that with your machine and see if it actually, if it's the same or if there's some big discrepancies, right? And what I did right there is to bring up the statement that the team made and transform it into a potential experiment. So instead of taking their conclusion as the truth, I took their conclusion as an assumption. And this is very important. This is what acting like a scientist is, right? Like you take something that is said to be true, quote unquote, as an assumption, and then you create an experiment around it. Now, it's not necessarily easy to do this. What I just did in this example was to transform a conclusion, which is like quick, reflexive, maybe intuitive even, into a question that helps the team themselves reflect. So this is one of the skills that I think we as Scrum Masters need to develop over time, and it's definitely a skill that I've had to learn to develop. A couple of ways to do this is to find a partner to reflect with. As you discuss a situation, either past or present, with a mentor or a colleague, you will have the time and the safe space to try out different ways of transforming that conclusion into a question that you can then give the team and help them reflect on what is going on. Another way to do this is to work with a coach. In fact, it is my usual advice that you should not try to coach others unless you are yourself in your own coaching journey with a coach. So if you really want to develop your ability to ask coaching questions, you can work with an experienced coach. We can get you in contact with one. You can email us at coaching@oikosofi.com, and the email will be on the show notes, so coaching@oikosofi.com, and we can definitely help you there. Working with a coach that helps you to learn to be a coach yourself is simply the best way to learn to be a better Scrum Master and Agile coach. Because at the end, what we're trying to do to become better Scrum Masters and better Agile coaches is really to grow as people, right? To learn new strategies, learn new techniques of relating and collaborating with the teams that we work with. For example, one important aspect for us to learn as coaches is to learn to incorporate other people's feelings and thinking into how we act. Instead of us projecting what we think and our conclusions into other people's actions, we need to incorporate their feelings and thinking into our own action. Let them influence our work and then act like a scientist, right? Ask questions, define assumptions, define experiments, and learn. Learning to ask better questions is best done with the help of a mentor or a coach. So that would be really my biggest advice here. It's taken me a lot of years and a lot of therapy and coaching to get to where I am today. So I don't expect everybody to get there immediately, but also through my experience, I've learned that it's much better to work with someone that helps you by becoming that reflection, right? Like that reflection partner, that coaching partner. And this process of growing as a person, learning to ask better questions, learning to act like a scientist, is how we learn to see what's really there, right? I started this by saying that one of the hardest lessons that I've had as a Scrum Master is to learn to see what's there instead of what I thought was there, right? Like when you see conflict, is conflict really there? Or are you the one bringing conflict to the team because you jumped to that conclusion, right? That's a fair question, right? And as a scientist, if you think like a scientist, conflict is your assumption. So let's try it out. Let's experiment and see if it is indeed what's going on. And we need to see what's there instead of projecting our conclusions into the team or situation. And that was the hardest lesson that I've had to learn as a Scrum Master and Agile coach. But before we finish this episode, I'd like to leave you with what I think will be some of the big trends in the Agile community for 2023. Now, these are my thoughts. It may be different for you. Take this with a grain of salt. But here are the two biggest trends I think we will have in the Agile community for 2023. So the first one is Agile product management. And note that I didn't say product ownership, because that's already Agile. It's part of Scrum. It came from Agile. I talked about, or I defined it as Agile product management. I think we are at an inflection point when it comes to the product ownership / product management relationship. In many organizations, I see that the product manager term or role is what they want their product owners to act on. And there's a big difference, right? Because product owners or product owner role is typically a Scrum role. So it's not a role that exists outside Scrum unless you pluck it from Scrum and apply it somewhere else. But product manager is a role that has existed for a long time, and there's an immense body of knowledge out there that can help product managers get better, and that's where they will eventually go to. Also, product management is a very wide aspect. It's a very wide area of responsibility. It goes all the way from understanding market trends, doing market research, to working with teams and individuals that are developing the products. I think product ownership work is still critical, but there's a lot more to product management that is not covered by Scrum. And organizations need that product management aspect. So it's really our job as the Agile community to help these PMs, these product managers, to grow and incorporate Agile thinking into their work. There was a talk at the 2022 Agile Online Summit. I'll put the link to that on the show notes about the death of the roadmap. And this is a great example of something that needs to change, right? Like the old roadmap thinking is not applicable in many Agile approaches. And we need to get product managers to learn to live outside that old style product management, old style road mapping specifically. So that's trend number one, Agile product management. And for me, trend number two is invitational change. Now, what is that? I think the second biggest trend really is invitational change. But what I mean by that is something that kind of switches our role as Scrum Masters. When it comes to change leadership, as I like to call it, we know that it's one of the key aspects of the Scrum Master role to work with change. Invitational change is about creating an environment where people and teams are invited to be part and to define what the change actions should be. The key difference between invitational change and what I would call project management change is that we start with the goal, not with the list of things that others need to do for the change to happen. And this is fundamental because when we start with the goal and we invite others to become part of the change, then we are allowing the organization to move towards that goal in a way that we can't necessarily predict, but in a way that is kind of self-correcting. In fact, invitational change, if we want to call it, would be like agile approach to change, right? It's about thinking through the goal, understanding what's there, and therefore also inviting people to contribute their ideas, their thoughts, and experiments, which is something very important here. These experiments are what's going to drive the change forward. But these experiments are going to be defined by the team that is involved in that. So the second trend is invitational change. The first trend is agile product management. Second trend, invitational change. We could talk about other things like continuous delivery, team topology, the unfixed framework, etc. But I think those two are the most important for 2023. All right, we're getting close to the end. If you have questions, leave us a comment on the show notes page, or why not email us at podcast@oikosofi.com and tell us what you thought of this episode. Thank you for listening. Now, I'm going to make a very short announcement, and then after that, we have a surprise for you. So thank you for listening to this episode and this week of bonus episodes. Leave us a comment at scrummastertoolbox.org about your thoughts on these topics that we covered today. We want to hear your perspective and also your questions. So you can send us questions. So email us at podcast@oikosofi.com. The email address is in the show notes. For now, thank you for listening. And now the surprise is coming. Right after this, we have, for the first time, the full podcast jingle. 2 minutes of upbeat, feel-good music to get you energized and excited for the day ahead. Here it comes.